A stable, wealthy Western Europe feels normal now, but it was never guaranteed. Fact 1. Without the Marshall Plan, Western Europe would likely have recovered much more slowly after the Second World War. Many countries were dealing with destroyed railways, ruined factories, food shortages, fuel shortages, and weak currencies. American aid did not solve everything, but it gave governments breathing room to import machinery, raw materials, and grain. Without that support, reconstruction would probably have dragged on for years longer, leaving ordinary people with lower wages, rationing, black markets, and weaker industrial output. Fact 2. One major political consequence would likely have been stronger communist parties in countries such as France and Italy. In the late 1940s, communism looked attractive to many exhausted and angry voters because capitalism seemed linked to depression, inequality, and war. If economic misery had continued without large-scale American assistance, communist parties could have gained far more influence in elections, labor unions, and coalition governments. That would not automatically mean Soviet control, but it would have made Western Europe far less politically stable. Fact 3. The early Cold War might have become much more dangerous. The Marshall Plan was not only about money, it also helped tie Western Europe closer to the United States. Without it, trust between American and Western European governments would have been weaker, and cooperation on security might have developed more slowly. That could have complicated the creation of a strong Western alliance and made Soviet pressure more effective, especially in divided places like Germany. A weaker West might have encouraged riskier moves from Moscow. Fact 4. There could also have been one limited positive effect. Europe might have become less economically dependent on the United States in the long run. Without American aid, governments may have been forced to build more self-reliant industrial strategies, stronger domestic planning systems, and tighter regional cooperation earlier out of necessity. Some industries might have developed with more local control instead of relying on imported capital and American influence. The problem is that this possible independence would probably have come with more hardship first. Fact 5. European integration might have taken a very different path. The Marshall Plan encouraged cooperation because countries had to coordinate recovery and trade. Without that push, the road toward institutions that later evolved into the European Union could have been slower, weaker, or more fragmented. On the other hand, fear and scarcity might also have pushed some states to unite faster simply to survive. So the likely result is not no Europe, but a more divided, tense, and economically uneven continent. Fact 6. Germany's recovery would likely have been far more uneven and politically fragile. West Germany benefited heavily from economic stabilization, industrial rebuilding, and restored trade under the Marshall Plan. Without it, unemployment, inflation, and housing shortages could have persisted much longer. This would have made democratic institutions weaker and more vulnerable to radical movements on both the left and right. A poorer, unstable West Germany would also have shifted the balance of power in Europe, potentially strengthening the position of East Germany and Soviet influence. Fact 7. Food shortages across Europe would likely have lasted significantly longer. In the late 1940s, many countries still relied on rationing systems, and agricultural production had not fully recovered due to damaged land, lack of equipment, and labour shortages. The Marshall Plan provided fertilizers, machinery, and emergency food shipments. Without this support, millions of people might have faced prolonged malnutrition, slower population recovery, and increased social unrest. Hunger has historically been one of the fastest ways to destabilize governments. Fact 8. The United States itself might have experienced a weaker post-war economic boom. The Marshall Plan helped create strong trading partners for American goods by rebuilding European markets. Without a recovered Europe, US industries would have had fewer customers abroad, potentially slowing export growth. This could have led to higher unemployment in certain sectors and a less dominant global economic position. So while the aid cost money up front, it also functioned as a long-term investment in global demand. Fact 9. Colonial empires might have lasted slightly longer in some regions. European powers like Britain and France were financially exhausted after the war, and the Marshall Plan indirectly helped stabilize their economies at home. Without that support, they might have been even weaker, which could go in two directions. Either they lose control faster due to collapse, or they cling more aggressively to colonies to extract resources. In some cases, prolonged instability in Europe might have delayed or intensified decolonization conflicts. Fact 10. Technological and industrial modernization in Europe would likely have been slower. The Marshall Plan did not just provide money, it encouraged the transfer of modern production techniques, management practices, and industrial efficiency methods from the United States. Without this exchange, European industries might have rebuilt using older systems, making them less competitive globally. Over time, this could have widened the economic gap between the United States and Europe, delaying Europe's return as a major industrial and technological centre. Fact 11. International trade within Europe would likely have remained fragmented for much longer. After the war, many countries imposed strict controls on imports, exports, and currency exchange because they lacked reserves and stable economies. The Marshall Plan encouraged the reduction of these barriers and promoted cooperation through shared recovery programs. Without it, countries might have continued protecting their own industries with tariffs and quotas. This would have slowed economic growth and kept Europe divided into smaller, less efficient national markets. Fact 12. Inflation and currency instability could have become a prolonged crisis across multiple countries. Several European currencies were already weak or close to collapse in the late 1940s. The Marshall Plan helped stabilize financial systems by injecting dollars and restoring confidence in national economies. Without that support, hyperinflation or repeated currency crises might have emerged in more countries, not just isolated cases. This would have made savings unreliable, discouraged investment, and pushed more economic activity into informal or black market systems. Fact 13. The formation of NATO might have been delayed or significantly weaker. The North Atlantic Alliance depended not only on shared security concerns, but also on economic trust and cooperation between the United States and Western Europe. Without the Marshall Plan, that trust would have developed more slowly. European countries struggling with internal crises might have been less willing or able to commit to collective defence. A weaker alliance could have changed the strategic balance during the Cold War, making Europe more vulnerable to external pressure. Fact 14. Migration patterns within and beyond Europe would likely have looked very different. Prolonged poverty and lack of opportunity could have pushed more Europeans to emigrate, especially to North America, Latin America, or other regions offering better economic prospects. At the same time, internal migration within Europe might have increased as people moved in search of work in the few areas that recovered faster. This could have created additional strain on cities, housing systems, and social services already under pressure. Fact 15. There is also a realistic possibility that economic inequality between European countries would have been much greater. Some nations with stronger industrial bases or access to resources might have recovered faster on their own, while others lagged far behind. The Marshall Plan helped reduce this gap by distributing aid across multiple countries. Without it, Europe could have become more polarized, with a few relatively stable economies surrounded by struggling neighbors, increasing political tension and reducing overall regional stability. Fact 16. Black markets would likely have remained a dominant part of daily life for much longer. In the immediate post-war years, shortages of basic goods like food, fuel, and clothing led many people to rely on informal and illegal trade networks. The Marshall Plan helped restore legal supply chains and stabilize prices. Without it, governments might have struggled to enforce economic rules, and trust in official systems could have weakened further. This would have normalized corruption and made rebuilding lawful economies significantly harder. Fact 17. Public health outcomes across Europe would likely have been worse in the late 1940s and early 1950s. War damage had disrupted hospitals, sanitation systems, and access to medicine. The Marshall Plan supported the import of medical supplies and improvements in infrastructure. Without that assistance, diseases linked to poor nutrition, overcrowding, and unsanitary conditions might have persisted longer. Higher mortality rates and slower recovery of population health would have added further strain on already fragile economies. Fact 18. Education systems would likely have taken longer to recover and modernize. Many schools and universities were damaged or lacked basic resources after the war. Economic recovery funds helped governments rebuild facilities, train teachers, and expand access to education. Without this support, a generation of students might have faced reduced educational opportunities, leading to a less skilled workforce. Over time, this would have limited innovation, productivity, and the overall pace of economic and social development. Fact 19. Political extremism. On both ends of the spectrum might have become more common. Economic instability, unemployment, and inequality tend to create conditions where radical ideologies gain support. Without the stabilizing effect of economic recovery programs, more citizens might have turned to parties promising drastic solutions. This would not necessarily mean immediate authoritarian rule, but it would increase polarization, weaken democratic norms, and make governments less effective at long-term planning and cooperation. Fact 20. The cultural influence of the United States in Europe might have been significantly reduced. The Marshall Plan was not just financial, it also encouraged cultural exchange, including media, business practices, and consumer culture. Without this connection, European societies might have retained more traditional or locally focused cultural identities in the short term. This could be seen as a positive in terms of preserving diversity, but it would also mean less cultural integration between the United States and Western Europe during a critical period. Fact 21. The division between Eastern and Western Europe might have become more pronounced and long-lasting. Without strong economic recovery in the West, the contrast between capitalist and communist systems would have been less clear in terms of living standards. This could have reduced the ideological advantage of Western Europe during the Cold War. Some countries on the edge of Soviet influence might have been more likely to shift eastward, or at least adopt neutral or mixed systems, creating a more fragmented political landscape. Fact 22. Urban reconstruction would likely have been significantly slower and less coordinated. Many European cities were heavily damaged or destroyed during the war, requiring large-scale rebuilding of housing, roads, and public services. The Marshall Plan helped provide materials, funding, and planning support. Without it, cities might have rebuilt in a more uneven and improvised way, with prolonged housing shortages and lower construction quality. This would have affected living conditions and economic productivity for decades. Fact 23. Labour movements might have become more confrontational and unstable. Workers across Europe faced unemployment, low wages, and poor working conditions after the war. Economic recovery helped reduce some of this pressure. Without it, strikes, protests, and industrial conflicts could have become more frequent and intense. In some cases, this might have led to major disruptions in production or even political crises, especially in countries where governments were already weak or divided. Fact 24. Scientific research and innovation in Europe would likely have developed more slowly. Economic recovery programs helped fund universities, laboratories, and industrial research. Without these investments, Europe might have lost more of its scientific talent to countries with better opportunities, particularly the United States. This brain drain could have delayed advancements in fields such as engineering, medicine, and technology, reducing Europe's role in global innovation during the mid-20th century. Fact 25. There is a realistic possibility that some countries might have experienced partial economic collapse before stabilizing. Without external support, governments facing extreme shortages and financial crises might have been forced into drastic measures such as strict rationing, debt default, or emergency economic controls. While some nations could eventually recover on their own, the short-term consequences would likely include severe hardship, political instability, and a slower overall return to normal economic activity across the region. Fact 26. The recovery of transportation networks would likely have taken much longer, affecting every part of the economy. Railways, ports, and roads were heavily damaged during the war, and rebuilding them required massive investment. The Marshall Plan helped supply materials like steel, machinery, and fuel. Without that support, transportation bottlenecks would have persisted, slowing the movement of goods and people. This would have limited trade, delayed industrial recovery, and kept entire regions economically isolated for a longer period. Fact 27. Banking systems across Europe might have remained weak and unreliable for years. After the war, many financial institutions were unstable, and public trust in banks was low. The Marshall Plan helped restore confidence by stabilizing currencies and supporting economic growth. Without it, people might have avoided banks, preferring cash or informal systems. This would have reduced access to credit for businesses, slowed investment, and made economic recovery more fragile and uneven across different countries. Fact 28. Agricultural recovery would likely have been slower and less efficient. Farms across Europe suffered from destroyed equipment, lack of fertilizers, and labor shortages. The Marshall Plan provided critical supplies that helped boost food production. Without it, many countries might have struggled to return to pre-war agricultural output levels. Continued dependence on food imports would have strained limited financial resources and prolonged food insecurity, especially in urban areas where local production was not possible. Fact 29. The global balance of economic power might have shifted even more heavily toward the United States. Europe's delayed recovery would have reduced its ability to compete in global markets, invest abroad, and influence international economic institutions. While the United States would still have been dominant, the gap between America and Europe might have been even wider. This could have led to a more unbalanced global economy, with fewer strong economic centres outside North America. Fact 30. Social welfare systems in Europe might have developed more slowly or unevenly. Post-war governments used the period of recovery to expand healthcare, education, and social protections. Economic support made these programs more financially viable. Without the Marshall Plan, governments facing deeper financial crises might have delayed or scaled back these reforms. This would have resulted in weaker social safety nets and greater inequality, especially affecting vulnerable populations in the early decades after the war. Fact 31. Over the long term, Europe would likely still have recovered, but with a very different timeline and structure. Even without the Marshall Plan, internal resources, trade, and gradual rebuilding would eventually restore economic activity. However, this recovery would have been slower, more uneven, and more politically unstable. The overall result would likely be a Europe that is less integrated, less prosperous in the mid-20th century, and more uncertain in its global role during the early Cold War period. Same continent, different timeline. Stability wasn't inevitable, it was built,